good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the second of our FEC Fellows sessions with a focus on the just transition. And today, the aim today is going to be to focus on one specific region, which can tell us quite a lot about what a just transition might mean and might look like in a lower latitude, resource rich, but also resource dependent coastal region. And that region is the Gulf of Guinea. And for us today, we've partnered with the Ghana IPO of Future Earth Coasts, and to make this a joint webinar between the FEC Fellows Just Transition series and also to mark the 10th anniversary, if I've got this right, of the IPO Ghana. This is a joint session, and across this session we're going to hear a breadth of contributions from some of the different scholars, different researchers working on various aspects relating to what climate and sustainability means in the Gulf of Guinea, and particularly what that means for people. And the contributions we're going to see are going to touch on a whole range of issues that build on what we saw in our first session. And we're going to hear a bit about how to bring knowledge from countries like Ghana into international policy processes. We're going to hear about what changes to climate and changes to governance mean for groundwater quality. We're going to hear about small-scale fisheries. So across the next hour and a half or so, we're going to hear a whole range of perspectives that are going to give kind of granularity, detail, and understanding of what a just transition means for somewhere that's maybe a bit different to what a lot of the Western-centric scholarly literature has looked at so far. Before we start, though, we do have one task to do, and that is to create a group photo. So if I could ask everybody to put their cameras on, and then I'll ask my colleagues at the FEC office to take some photos for us. So if everybody could just have their cameras on, we could get some pictures.
Everyone, please open your camera. Thank you. Okay, all right. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, great. Thank you very much indeed. So we've also got a nice little bit of continuity this morning with our first session, in that our first speaker today is going to be Professor Dennis Ahito, who spoke in the last session and gave us a bit of an introduction to what to some of the activities that the Ghana IPO are up to, particularly in coastal regions. I'd now like to invite Dennis to come and give us some keynote introductory remarks. So Dennis, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Leslie, for this wonderful opportunity. I recall that a couple of weeks ago we started this discussion, and I was privileged to be part of the panelists that spoke on the issues of just transition from the perspective of impactful research and capacity building towards sustainability and resilience of Africa's coastal and marine sectors. And in that presentation, I actually did allude to the fact that in West Africa, particularly at ACECOR, which is the Africa Center of Excellence in Coastal Resilience, we are actually building on a knowledge platform that also mobilizes finance and political dialogue for research. And within that context, I spoke about ACECOR and what we were doing. Please, do you hear me? Please, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. There's a little bit of background noise, but we can hear you well.
Yeah, I think then some others must mute. Yeah. Yeah, so within that context, I spoke about what we were doing from our part of the region within the Gulf of Guinea. By extension, also some areas around the Indian Ocean, because we do have students from the East Africa, but most of them primarily have worked within the Gulf of Guinea. So as a regional knowledge platform, we are very committed to impactful research. Research intensiveness is one of the key focus of our program. And within that opportunity that we have, we've been able to bring students from across Africa, currently 15 countries, involving 30 PhDs and several master students, numbering about 90, who are researching on various topics ranging from coastal geomorphology and engineering through climate change and adaptation to blue economy, governance, and social resilience. Some others are also working on disaster risk management and migration, and then also issues to do with ecosystems and biodiversity. We all do agree that in these emerging fields, there are a lot of issues that we have to deal with from our part of the world. And so as a regional platform supported through several partnerships, we are very committed to getting to the bottom of the issues that eventually we can bring to policy attention and mobilize the needed resources, technical and financial, and of course, scientific knowledge to be able to do this. And so we are honored that in this particular session today, we're going to have some of our students who are already online and have prepared to take us through some of the issues from their researches, and then also seek your input in terms of how some of these issues that they bring up could be reformulated or supported for better outcomes. Just yesterday, I want to just say that some other ISCO students reached out to me and have also expressed a lot of interest to talk on this topic, given that FEC would have the opportunity. We will be happy to also bring on board some other students from other regions in Africa who are in ISCO. We are particularly happy that this fits into our 10th anniversary activities, which eventually we will document as part of events to mark the 10 years of our existence. So on that note, I wish to thank you all, particularly the FEC leadership and also FEC IPOs around the world. I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity, the platform you are giving to us as a center. I'm also very thankful to the students, researchers who have agreed to serve as panelists for today's program. On that note, I wish to thank you once again for the opportunity. Good morning from Ghana.
Thank you very much indeed, Dennis, for those extremely thoughtful and valuable opening remarks. I think you've hit on some really important points there, which go right to the kind of ethos that we want to develop with these events, particularly around not just locally appropriate knowledge, but also locally led knowledge creation in support of a just transition, and also particularly applied knowledge. You touched there on links with government, with industry, and also underpinning that with good quality and rigorous science. So I'm also really excited, Martin, to hear there's interest from others in your network, and we'd look forward to talking with you further about how we can develop these. So we're keeping to very good time this morning, which is absolutely wonderful. As a chair, that's really good to see. And on that basis, then, what I'd like to do is I would like to pass over to our first speaker, who is Rael Adiambo. So Rael is going to talk to us about a review of phytoplankton research in the face of climate change. Particularly, I think what's going to be interesting in this is to hear about an issue that I think is really critical and important, particularly how knowledge from lower latitudes from countries like Ghana tends to be underrepresented in global discourse. But I won't give the whole presentation. At this point, I'm just going to pass over to Rael to talk us through this issue. Over to you. Just give it a minute. I suspect we might be underway shortly. Okay, yep, we can hear you now.
We can hear you now.
Sorry. So thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Rael Adiambo, and I'm from Kenya. And I'm very excited to share with you an aspect of my work that I've been working on to understand the underrepresentation of phytoplankton research within the tropics. So climate change is perhaps one of the most important pressing issues facing the world right now. And this is caused mainly by the emission of greenhouse gases by anthropogenic activities. And the resultant impact of this is that evidence has shown that the Earth has been warming gradually over the last century. And it will continue to do so, even if now we put interventions to stop it. And this has led to significant changes into our environment, whether it is terrestrial or aquatic. So if we take an example of coastal and marine ecosystems, climate change impacts them by changing their ocean temperature, aquatic temperatures. There's also been evidence of increased ocean acidification, sea level rise, and extreme weather conditions. And as a result, many aquatic ecosystems have been affected. And we have also seen that particularly in tropical ecosystems, because of these changes, our species are now tending to migrate polewards. And if this trend continues, many tropical ecosystems will be affected. And at the base of coastal and marine ecosystem are phytoplankton. And these phytoplankton communities serve an important purpose because they are the basis of the food webs and support food web structures from zooplankton to large fish and even whales. So these important phytoplankton are abundant and can be found in nearly all ecosystems on Earth, whether it is freshwater, brackish water, or marine ecosystems. They have short generation times and large population sizes, which enable them to rapidly adapt to changes in their environment. They are also very important in mediating the impacts of climate change because of the role they play in the biological carbon pump. And as a result, this phytoplankton can be used as important measures of aquatic water quality and to understand how global change factors are influencing coastal and marine ecosystems. So when we look at research trends within the tropics, we find that this narrow strip of land that is located between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn is home to almost 3/4 of all species on Earth and considered a biodiversity powerhouse for the whole world. At the same time, this area is extremely vulnerable to global change factors. And many studies have shown that the tropical biodiversity is on the edge of its existence because of changes in the environment as a result of global change factors such as climate change. At the same time, many researchers have also pointed out that tropical ecosystems do not get the attention they need in terms of research efforts, particularly when it's related to the impacts of climate change. So to understand how tropical ecosystems have been represented in research, we analyzed data from the Web of Science. And then we use keywords such as climate change, phytoplankton, growth rate, and chlorophyll A, mainly because of our interest in the research area that we undertake, but also because of the importance of these functional attributes in global biomass. And the data that was downloaded was divided into different categories based on location, ecosystem, and climatic region. So our results found that almost 80% of the research that was conducted was located in temperate and polar regions. Only 12% of the research was conducted in tropical ecosystems. And this observation is not unique to phytoplankton research in the wake of climate change. Several other researchers have also seen this observation, and they attributed this to the fact that many countries in higher latitude areas have large economies that support specialized research, such as phytoplankton ecology research. But when we look at tropical tropical countries, for instance, many of the economies are considered to be developing, and therefore there might be lack of investment in research, and particularly specialized research, because these countries tend to put more attention in research that is directly linked to socioeconomic activities, such as forestry, fisheries, and agriculture. On the other hand, phytoplankton research, which does not have like a direct link to socioeconomic factors, might be ignored. So when we looked at the aquatic production across the aquatic ecosystems, we find that marine ecosystems had the highest production, followed by brackish ecosystems and then freshwater ecosystems. And this is not surprising because marine ecosystem comprise the largest proportion of aquatic ecosystems. And therefore, it makes sense that more research will be done to understand marine ecosystems. However, it is becoming more and more important to also put a lot of emphasis on freshwater and brackish water ecosystems, because these ecosystems, the impacts that are affecting these ecosystems eventually find their way into marine ecosystems. And we have seen in cases such as plastic pollution. So we also analyzed the research production per country just to get a global view of who is undertaking what research. And it's important to note at this point that this map was not generated based on which country is producing the publication, but based on the study area in which the data was collected from. And we can see that higher latitude countries are doing much more in terms of phytoplankton research. A lot of gaps in Africa with significant, not so significant research being undertaken in East Africa and Southern Africa. China and US leading, and a lot of attention being given to Antarctica. So we also analyzed trends within the tropics itself, and we found that almost half of the research activities in the tropics were in Asia, followed by South America. In terms of countries in the tropics, we found that the highest producers of phytoplankton research were India, followed by Brazil, Australia, and Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, Africa, whose about 80% of landmass is located in the tropics and subtropics areas, only attributed to 12% of the research. And within the global research production, the contribution of Africa to global research was even below 1%, which is very worrying. So when we came to a type of aquatic ecosystems, brackish ecosystem in the tropics were the least researched, with only 7%. So how do we then remedy this continuous underrepresentation of research in the tropics? And we found out that many countries in the tropics, because of their underdevelopment, do not have the capacities, the institutional, technical capacities to undertake research. So to remedy this situation, we suggested the following. One, there is a critical need to increase manpower in specialized marine research, such as phytoplankton ecology. And this can be done through increasing funding opportunities, scholarships, short training opportunities. And at this point, I would really want to highlight one initiative that has produced very good results, and that is the NF and POGO shipyard training opportunities that have led to the capacity development of many, many researchers and students, particularly from developing countries. And the second one is to increase the technical infrastructure capacities as well. And we found out that the infrastructure and equipment required to do specialized research is very expensive to buy and to maintain. Therefore, one way that countries in the tropics can go about it is to develop their own low-cost alternatives that will enable them to collect the data, as well as develop the potential for citizen science to routinely monitor the environment, which is a low-cost way to bypass some of the expensive infrastructure that is required. Another thing is that organizations within developing countries can partner with private sector and their partners in the north as well, so that they can increase the capacity to undertake research, such as sharing research vessels. The third way is to enhance financial support in the area of phytoplankton research. And this can only be done if phytoplankton research is put at the center of national priorities. And in addition to that, researchers in the tropics and developing countries in the tropics particularly can partner with other institutions that have already established phytoplankton research labs to develop projects and proposals that can be funded. And the last one is to increase policy and institutional frameworks. and not just to undertake phytoplankton research, but to also protect the intellectual properties that are generated within the tropics. At this point, I would like to emphasize on the point that the challenges that derail phytoplankton research within the tropics are complex, and therefore they will need concerted global efforts to remedy them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for a very impactful, very thoughtful contribution there, I think, and it's quite stark to see the extent to which we have these imbalances globally in where phytoplankton research is done, and also who is doing it. The way we're going to work with questions is that we will save questions to the end. So we'll work through the presentations, then we'll have open questions discussion at the end. So thank you very much, Rael, for a fascinating contribution. I'd now like to invite our second speaker, Chinomso Obubiko. I apologise if I got that right, who's going to talk to us about assessing the role of mangrove ecosystems in flood risk reduction to the coastal communities of river states using coastal vulnerability models. So again, this is something that we touched on in the first session about just transitions going beyond being about emissions reduction and jobs to also being about who is at risk, who's at risk of harm under a changing climate, and how does one reduce the risks that are faced, and how do you particularly ensure that the most vulnerable coastal dwellers are not put at risk. Over to you.
Yep. Okay, can you see my slides good?
Yep, we have your slides now. Over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you may be listening from. My name is Chinomso Obubiko, and I'll be presenting on the role of mangroves in flood reduction in coastal communities using the inverse coastal vulnerability model. Climate change and biodiversity loss can be combated through nature-based solutions. Our landscapes are still dominated by urbanization, leaving very little room for nature, even though nature is our life support system. A nature-based solution involves protecting our forests, wetlands, grasslands, and marine habitats through locally led projects that benefit communities. And they can also be sustained. If they are designed and implemented by local communities while also respecting their cultures. This way, people and nature could produce a variety of outcomes that benefit the society and support biodiversity, which are the foundations of a sustainable development. Between 2001 and 2018, floods affected over 3 billion people, causing lots of economic damage, and also over 80,000 kilometers of mangrove that has been lost since 1996 is considered restorable if we act now. Research also shows that coastal flooding is the second highest occurring disaster in the world, and this is a threat to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. These are some of the communities I worked in during my field trip. This community right here has a muddy beach, and this has a sandy beach, and these two ecosystems provide little protection in the event of flood. Now, this inverse model was applied to the coastal communities of River State to basically the inverse model is used to visualize disaster risk under different ecosystem conditions. And it is also used to understand the distribution of risk and coastal hazards for people living along the coastline. And the model helps us to see the connection between coastal protection and natural habitat, and also helps decision makers to in decision making that as it regards disaster risk reduction. Now, the model seeks to help us understand where marine and coastal habitats provide protection from flooding and how much protection they provide. It also shows us opportunities for conservation or restoration and even afforestation, thereby building a more resilient coastal community. As I mentioned earlier, this model was applied in in the coastal communities of Rivers State, Nigeria. And Rivers State is located in the Niger Delta area. This area has the largest mangrove expanse in Africa and the third largest in the world. And it is known for its crude oil deposits, which threatens the ecosystems in the area. Now, this on my way to one of my study areas, I came across this large expanse of mangroves in this condition, and on the water, you see, if you look closely, you can see oil on the water, which means the oil has impacted on these mangroves. Now, the assumption underlying the model is that coastal ecosystems are considered as effective defense against floods, and their protective role is ranked under the common assumption that degraded ecosystems are less effective in protecting coastal communities than healthy ecosystems. And it also assumes that fixed and stiff habitats that penetrate the water column, like the mangroves, provide more protection than flexible and seasonal habitats like the seagrass. These are some of the results gotten from the model. Now, this is a current, these are some of the scenarios from the model, and this is a current exposure level of the area. But I will be focusing on the with mangrove and without mangrove scenarios. Here we see the with mangrove scenario, which assumes that the mangrove ecosystems are in its pristine state and therefore provides protection to the community, hence the lowest exposure. And without mangrove scenario assumes that the mangroves are degraded and therefore do not provide protection to the communities, hence the highest exposure. And we see the maps of this area, the current exposure, which shows areas that are exposed. The areas in red are areas that are highly exposed. We see some areas in red over here, and here, and also here, the underexposure without mangroves, we see areas that are highly exposed to flooding. And then under exposure with mangroves, we see a reduction in the areas that are highly exposed. We now see more of the greens and the yellows, which signifies low and intermediate exposure, signifying the protective role of mangroves in the event of flood. And therefore, as a result, from conclusions from these results, this study recommends climate financing to fund mangrove conservation, afforestation and restoration projects, even tree planting projects in the area. And the results can also be used as a decision tool for stakeholders in disaster risk reduction, for them to include ecosystems while making decisions for these decisions as regards disaster risk reduction. And this study also recommends climate education in rural areas, with stakeholders also inclusive, in order to educate them on the role of mangroves as a nature-based solution. And also it recommends climate engagements aimed at changing the perceptions towards mangrove conservation, with stakeholders also included. And lastly, but not the least, it recommends policies on oil exploration to tackle the event or incidents of oil spills in this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for a wonderful contribution, and indeed also for keeping to time, which makes my job a lot easier. So again, I think we saw here another kind of piece of the Just Transitions puzzle, especially around the role of natural ecosystems in reducing harm and reducing vulnerability. And this language of nature-based solutions, understanding what that means in a lower latitude context. So I would now like to invite over our third speaker, Ayeta Grace. Ayeta is going to tell us about groundwater quality and governance in the coastal communities of Ghana. So, as we have different kinds of social and economic change, we also have changes to governance systems and the physical environment. Hopefully what we're going to see in the next contribution is a bit more about how you can manage and support localities as the environment changes. So Ayeta, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Ayeta Imobonuvi Grace, and I'll be presenting on the topic groundwater quality and governance in the coastal communities of Ghana. Groundwater is a crucial resource on Earth, as it provides about 97% accessible fresh water. And it also provides about 50% of the water needed for drinking. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. It also provides about 50% of the water needed for drinking and irrigation worldwide. In addition, it provides about 33.3% of the water used in industries. Aside serving human needs, groundwater is also very important to ecosystems. And these ecosystems range from terrestrial ecosystems to coastal ecosystems like lagoons. The dependence on groundwater is fast rising, and one of the reasons for this is the pollution of surface water. You can see in this picture a lagoon here in Ghana, the Kole Lagoon. And then another reason for increased pollution of surface water is the issues of the effect of climate change, which is leading to increased flooding. The picture here is actually a picture of our university community last year when there was a flood. So these factors are leading to the pollution of surface water and hence increased dependence on groundwater. Research has shown that in urban cities in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a fast rise in groundwater use, particularly for drinking. Now, this important resource is faced with its own challenges, and some of the factors leading to the pollution of groundwater are illegal gold mining, open defecation, improper waste disposal, this poor siting of septic tanks in relation to groundwater, especially the water points itself. And so in looking at the research approach and solutions to the problems facing groundwater, we propose a two-way approach using the interdependence between groundwater assessment and its governance. So we think groundwater assessment and groundwater governance are interdependent. While groundwater assessment provides a good understanding of the resource, which is very much needed for its proper management, groundwater governance provides the monitoring framework needed for groundwater assessment. And so what are some of the research gaps in groundwater studies in Ghana? Very few studies have assessed the bacteriological pollution of groundwater in the coastal areas of Ghana, where a quarter of the nation's population live. Also, very little is known about the groundwater microbiome in Ghana. Similarly, studies assessing the potential health and ecological risk of groundwater associated with groundwater pollution along the coast are few. And lastly, studies assessing the status of groundwater governance in Ghana are rare. The few studies that have done so have been focused on the groundwater users, and in some cases, they were focused on water resources in general. And usually when this is done, groundwater is often missed. And so our study aimed to fill some of these research gaps that we have found. And we chose to work in the coastal areas of Ghana, and we picked a representative community from each of the administrative regions along the coast. Some of our results are shown in this slide. So with respect to the concentration of E. coli and total coliform, we found concentrations that were all above 0. And the World Health Organization, as well as the government of Ghana, has fixed a standard for drinking water, which is 0 E. coli and 0 total coliform in 100 males. But in all the study communities where we worked, and within the 2 seasons, the concentration of E. coli and total coliform were all found to be above 0, which is the standard for drinking water. Also, we checked the exposure to E. coli from drinking, and we found that exposures to E. coli from drinking were all above 0. And so it means people who consume this water are actually consuming E. coli. And exposure was highest in Winneba, where we had about 23 E. coli per day. And then on the risk associated with groundwater pollution, we found that the risk of infection per day were all above 0.5 in all the study communities. And the risk of infection per year, as well as risk of illness per year, were all 1 in the study communities. As a result, we had to take a snapshot of the issues facing groundwater at the community level. So we did a focus group discussion with community leaders, and we found that groundwater is a very important resource in these communities. So across the study communities, we found that the use of wells are actually their main sources of water, except in Accra, where they depend a lot on the Ghana Water Company, which is the piped water. And then we also found that groundwater is very important because we wanted to establish the importance of this resource in these communities. And in Esiama, we had one of the community leaders saying, oh, it's very important because of the high percentage of the population using it. And that was the case in all the study locations. So we had to find out some of the challenges they have accessing clean water. We found that during the dry season, they do experience a shortage of water. And another problem they had accessing clean water was the issue of saltwater intrusion. Those were some of the key problems facing these communities. And then we also had to find out some of the factors predisposing their wells to contamination. We noticed that poor adherence to construction standard was a key factor. Poor siting of wells. So you have people siting wells beside waste drains and gutters beside their septic tanks, very close to their septic tanks. We also found that in Accra, a unique problem we noticed was the shallowness of their wells. Their wells are very shallow. And then we also wanted to know some of the rules guiding groundwater at the community level. In most of the study locations, rules that related to groundwater were mainly simple hygiene rules. For example, the siting of burial grounds. So there were some rules that burial grounds shouldn't be sited within the communities because of their groundwater sources. So those were some of the rules that were related to groundwater. And then at the regional and national level, we wanted to know if these leaders are aware of some of the laws existing. In all the communities, except in Esiama, the leaders, they were not aware of any rules or policies related to groundwater. But then in Esiama, the leaders were aware of some professional laws guiding the construction of wells and boreholes. We also wanted to know if there are groundwater monitoring teams within the community or networks. We found that there were no groundwater monitoring networks, but in Esiama and Winneba, they did made mention of the sanitary inspectors who do come around to check sanitation issues around their surroundings. And so I have some pictures of some of the wells highlighting some notable problems, some very visible problems that you can see. You can see a well in figure A sited just beside a very unsanitary point. And then you can see a well in figure B. The construction standard here is obviously not adhered to. Aprons are supposed to, this well is supposed to have an apron, and the apron is supposed to slope away from the well, but that is not the case. And so you have water, spilled water accumulating around the well. Then you have a well here that is sited just beside a waste drain. In Accra, we have a very shallow well. And then in Keita, you also have a well that doesn't have an apron and does not have a well cover. And so we did an expert-based assessment to find out to assess groundwater governance in Ghana. We found that technical capacity was incipient. Incipient simply means at an early stage of development. Technical capacity was incipient, although the existence of basic hydrological maps was shown to be at acceptable level. But groundwater quality monitoring was incipient. For instance, we found out that groundwater monitoring has almost come to an halt since 2014. And that was since 2014, what the wells we have been monitored in Ghana are just 5. And those wells were adopted by academic institutions. So all over the country, we have just 5 wells that are being monitored currently. Then for legal and institutional capacity, we found that the criterion related to the presence of a government agency that is to serve as a guardian for groundwater resource, that was optimum. Then cross-policy coordination was incipient in general, and then operational capacity was also incipient. So all the criterion we have there, for instance, enforcement of groundwater policy is incipient, just beginning to develop or at an early stage of development. And so in general, groundwater governance capacity in Ghana was shown to be incipient from our results. And so some of our recommendations from this study are that there is a need to implement the groundwater management strategy of 2011. So in 2011, a groundwater management strategy was put in place, setting short-term and long-term means to address the problems facing groundwater. Obviously, from our findings, only the short-term recommendations were steps towards the short-term recommendations were implemented. The long-term, nothing was done regarding that. So one of the strategy was that they would have an agency, the River Basin Management Board, incorporate the monitoring and the monitoring of groundwater with their activities, into their activities, but that was not done. Then we also recommend that there should be adequate financing of groundwater research and monitoring activities, both from the central government, and this can be achieved by collaborating with institutions within the country and also with donor institutions. We also recommend that action should be taken to delineate aquifers in Ghana. Training should be provided for staff in groundwater management institutions. Public awareness creation is very much needed on the importance of groundwater and its protection. And then there is also a need to build cooperation between groundwater management institutions, scientific institutions, and the water users. For example, some of the technical capacity that are lacking in the groundwater management institutions are very much available in academic institutions. And so if there is a collaboration between these institutions, groundwater governance capacity would be very much improved. And then lastly, we recommend that an open access database should be created to promote data sharing among institutions. To conclude on my presentation, I would want to say that groundwater is an invisible resource and is a hope for many, especially in the face of climate change and surface water pollution. And so even though it is out of sight, it should never be out of our minds. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Ayeta. Another fascinating piece of empirical research on a critically important topic. And I think what really struck me there was the way in which you brought together different types of knowledge and data. So we saw some of the observation-based work, and we also saw the focus group-based work, and actually seeing people's own experiences and understandings of groundwater and looking at how that perhaps matched up or didn't to the data. But like as he said at the start and came back at the end as well, in areas that are maybe facing different development pressures and also reliance on agriculture as well as things like illegal mining, there's a lot of pressures on a groundwater system. Actually creating the evidence base to understand that is absolutely vital. So this leads to the last of our 4 contributions this morning, which is from Richmond Korang. And this is going to be looking at Ghana's small-scale fisheries, going from vulnerability to viability. And again, fisheries, another part of the just transition picture. What does a just transition mean for livelihoods, especially livelihoods in resource-dependent areas and societies? So, Richmond, over to you for our last contribution.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so my name is Richmond, and today's presentation, I will be taking you through Ghana's small-scale fisheries from vulnerability to viability. This is a case study of the Pra River Basin and the Aquidar community. Okay, so what makes a system vulnerable or a community vulnerable? We are talking about the degree of sensitivity, exposure, the potential impact, and the community's ability to adapt is what makes it either vulnerable or not vulnerable. So the location of the Pra River Basin in Ghana. The Pra River is an area of about 10 kilometers square, and the livelihood around this river body is fishery, and it supports about 25,000 people. It flows from the eastern part of Ghana, that is around the Kwewu, southward for about 240 kilometers to enter the Atlantic Ocean in Shama. So Shama is the community you are seeing right here, where the Pra River enters the ocean. You can see the community is on a sandbar. Then our second location is the Aquidar community, also a community on a sandbar. So it's also a small fishing community in the Ahanta West district of Ghana. And the community is also bounded by a forest reserve, oil plantation, oil palm plantations, we have rubber plantations, mangroves, and it makes it very favorable for its inhabitants. And this community is, as I said earlier, is also on a sandbar. So as you can see, a river also joins the sea, and the community is surrounded by the river and the sea. So we have habitats around these 2 communities, and some of these habitats that I came across in my study are the estuaries, we have rivers, we have marshlands, we have mangroves, and also we have sandy beaches. But what makes these small-scale fishing communities vulnerable? So we'll be taking them, first of all, let me start with the ecological vulnerabilities. So with the ecological vulnerabilities, we have habitat degradation, we have pollution, we have decline in fish stock, and we have the almighty climate change. The habitat degradation has to do with what we call the mangrove harvest and overexploitation of mangroves within these 2 communities. And with regards to pollution also, we have what we call the galamsey, which has to do with the illegal small-scale mining. As you can see here, where the Pra River enters the sea at Shama, you can see the difference in color change, where the river is very polluted as a result of illegal fishing. We also have decline in fish stock. Also, the practice of the IUU fishing by these fishermen, and climate change, which brings about high sea level rise. We have sea level rise, and then climate change. We have flooding as a result of climate change during the rainy seasons. Also, talk of economic vulnerabilities. We also have the communities are experiencing high cost of production and exploitation. Exploitation, as in the fishermen spend a lot of money going to sea to fish, whilst those who process the fishes, as in the fishmongers and other processes, also spend a lot of money to do this process. We have invasion of local waters by foreign vessels, what we call the distant water fleet. And we also have high level of poverty and illiteracy rates within the coastal communities. This is quite rampant when it comes to our coastal areas in Ghana. And we also have the aspect of unemployment. Most of these people there are unemployed. If they are not fishing or there are no fishes to catch, they mostly have nothing doing. So we also will talk about social vulnerability, which has to do with migration, behavioral issues, low environmental or health concern. These community members have social issues when it comes to migration. They are refusing to migrate in the first place because they feel that they have a sense of an attachment to their current settlement. They feel their ancestors moved in there, and this cultural attachment is making it difficult for them to move. That is also, yeah. So we have low environmental health concern. They really do not care about the environment, as you can see from right there. They pollute around, and when flood comes, all these debris are carried into their homes. Then we also talk about institutional and governance vulnerability. We also have the aspect where our management systems are very centralized. Then we have weak property rights and poor law enforcement. People put up structures anywhere around the coastal areas of Ghana without anyone really, they don't even take cautions. They just put up structures because there are no proper law enforcement to caution them. So moving small scale fisheries into viability. So what are we to do if we want to move these communities into viability, the small scale fishing communities around my study area into vulnerability? We are talking about alternative livelihood. Are they always going to depend on small scale fishes? Is fishing the only thing they have to do just because they are in coastal areas? We are talking about strengthening law enforcement when it comes to putting up structures and the practice of IUU fishing. We're talking about decentralization system of management. The centralized system of management needs to stop, where the chiefs and the elders within communities can also be given rights, maybe formally, can be backed formally, so that they can also, since they live around these resources, I think they have better understanding of how to manage, bring the community together to manage it. We're also talking about relocation or improve housing structures in areas where people are refusing to move. Also improve management regimes. We have the fisheries co-management, and we have the community resource management area, what we call the CREMA. We can also improve their activities where the government comes together with the community members in managing these resources. Sensitization, education on environmental issues leading to change in behavior. We also have to educate these communities, sensitize them on environmental issues, on climate change, on the ecosystems around them, so they can value them more, because this ecosystem provides great services to them. If by making them understand the importance they derive from these ecosystems, I think they would better cherish the ecosystems. And we also talk about revised policies and regulations. Policies like closed seasons, distant water fleets, subsidies on premise fuel, use of appropriate fishing gears, especially something like the subsidies on premise fuel. Because there are subsidies, the fishermen, it makes it easier for them to overfish, overexploit. if government is to provide such policies, I think it would help them curb all these how do you call it, small scale fishery more practices. So there are challenges. It's not easy, although there has been stated that these responses to viabilities, we think it's viable, it can work, but then there are challenges. Challenges has to do with funding, change in government, land tenure issues. We have little or no respect for traditional rules, sense of belonging and attachment. With funding, if when people even decide to relocate, are there available fundings on new structures they have to put up? Change in government. Sometimes the communities agree with government on certain on certain relocation issues where government gives them land, but then as soon as there is change of government, all these plans they go to a halt because the government has been removed and there is new government, so which means it's coming with its new policies. And land tenure issues with the aspect of Shama, the community also have decided to move. But there is an issue where they are also a migrant community. The place doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the people of Shama. So the land moving to the new place is not even allowed. They have to come in agreement with the Shama community for them to first of all agree to even lease the place or give it to them permanently. Little or no respect for traditional rules. This has to do with the technology, education, and even religion. People have found Christianity, let me say, so they tend not to even listen to their traditional rulers again. So when they pass out laws, the community members don't tend to listen. And the sense of belonging, as I said earlier. So the research protocol, how did I go about this research? First of all, together with the community members, we identified, prioritized problems, and then we developed a research protocol, conducted the field work. The results were disseminated through workshops involving multiple stakeholders. We developed toolkits to synthesize and educate the community on the findings. Capacity building, and then we also conducted restoration activities such on depleted mangroves, as an example. Then research output wasn't shelved. It was also put in the form of videos, articles, and reports. And they can be used by other research and scaled up to other fishing communities. Thank you. That'll be all for my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much indeed, Richmond. Again, a whole range of issues there that you touched on. I think a lot of synergy with many of the other talks that we saw as well. A lot of common themes, which I'm going to come back to at the end. But again, just seeing about how you deal with some of these issues around government, around how you deal with local connections, understanding of the land. I see that Dennis's hand is up. Before we do that, though, we've got a lot of people
information.
Here. Yes.
Just a quick
absolutely.
information. Unfortunately, Leslie, my sincere apology. I need to leave this meeting for another meeting with other postgraduate students.
Great. Before you go, we'd like to take a group photo because we've got everybody. So if everyone can put their cameras on, we'll get a full group photo again.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Please open your camera again. Please open your camera. Then we will take a group photo and we will promote it on all of our media channels. So yeah. Hi everyone, please open your camera. I will try to get a nice shot.
Okay.
Oh, so many people here. Okay. Then, all right. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Fraser, for that. And then thanks, Dennis, for staying around. We're going to go to questions now. The way I want to do this, we'll just open up questions to the floor. Nalin, I can see your hand is up already, so I'll pass over to you first.
Ask a quick question or start off with a comment because I have to go away in a few minutes. In our experience, my experience in Sri Lanka and also in South Asia, when you study specific sites, like the last presentation and possibly the one about the mangroves and the vulnerability, though that may have been more from a remote sensing perspective, I suppose. But when you actually go to specific places, then the cost of doing that is actually the cost of usually going to that location. And one thing that we've tried to get people to think about is doing covering as many aspects of that location as possible with those visits. And it doesn't always work out, of course, because people don't maybe from different fields don't talk to each other. So that's because, and especially with a large country like Ghana. Now, I was having a quick look at the two locations in the last presentation by Richmond, and I see that both of those communities are living on what appears to be a very vulnerable sand spit, especially the first one, the Shama. If I look at Google Earth, I find in the last 10 years, there have been tremendous changes to the adjoining sand spit. So now when you talk about climate change, it seems to me like you're looking only at the impact of climate change on the fishery. But what about the impact of climate change on actually the very existence as a community and disasters?
Well, yeah, climate change has also really affected the community. If you are on site and you go to the community, you realize that almost half of the community has been taken over by the sea. Even the chief's house of the community has been taken over by the sea as a result of high sea level rise. So yeah, climate change is really impacting the community, not just fishery. Fishery is, let's say, the livelihood of the community. So affecting the community is affecting their livelihood. Therefore,
so what I mean is the impact of shoreline change or potential shoreline change. How would you factor that into your overall picture? That really is my question.
Yeah. No, this is not that. The effect of shoreline change wasn't part of my research. It wasn't in my research area. I wasn't looking at shoreline change. I was just looking at the effect of the sea level rise on fisheries, as in livelihood within the community. But there are studies at the center which are looking like the shoreline change, the morphological change of the shoreline, and I think other people are looking into that as well.
Okay, that's great. So that's what I was trying to make a point. So if you are already thinking like that, so that because usually it's very difficult to go back to these areas sometimes because it's expensive, and sometimes because the people don't like to have too many different people coming and asking them questions without any actual result for them. That's another thing that one has to be very sensitive about, because they get sick and tired of people coming and asking questions, but not having any solutions for them. So anyway, so if you're already thinking in that integrated way, that's excellent.
Yeah, the area is actually a research fatigue area, because day in, day out, we have different type of researchers going there to question them, and they see no improvement. So when you go there, the first thing they say is, you come here every day, you collect data, we don't see you again. So yeah, it's really an issue in the community.
Right. Yeah, thanks very much. I think, Nalin, you've picked up on two really important points there. I think one being, as you say, the idea of doing as much as you can when you go somewhere, and that might sometimes involve thinking creatively about working with your colleagues, and seeing how you can maybe do things that benefit other people, even if it's maybe slightly outside your own research area. I once got sent to a beach to dig up some sand that a physicist thought might be radioactive. I had no idea what it was, but he'd asked me to do it to make most of my time there. And the second is this really important point about, as you say, feeding back to communities, particularly kind of being sensitive to communities, places that might be over-researched, and doing that, that research in a way that is not seen as being extractive, and thinking about channels to feed that back. So some great points there. I'd like to ask, anybody else have any questions?
You have to raise your hand on the Zoom as well, Liana.
Liana.
Yes, I have one that's directed to our colleague who spoke about phytoplankton. The coverage of the Web of Science is based on what is in the mainstream journals. And just like in many developing countries, such as in my country, in the Philippines, a lot of reports are produced on a project basis. And also there are government reports. Of course, the Web of Science survey will not include this. So is there specific steps taken to encourage researchers to publish in the mainstream journals, which also has publication costs that needs to be supported? So I just wanted to throw that to Rael. Thank you. Your sound.
Thank you very much for the question. I think this is a major challenge that is affecting not only the Philippines, but many developing countries.
Yes.
Is that the problem is not that we are not undertaking research, and
Exactly.
I'm sure that the blank spaces in Africa, people have continuously undertook research on phytoplankton. But
Yes.
then there is a great need for us then to target our research in
Yes.
these journals, and then to
Mhm.
have a conversation that looks at costs versus developing countries, so that we can be able to highlight some of the very important research that is already being undertaken in developing countries. So
Yes.
the Web of Science, of course, was a tool, but it's also
Mhm.
highlighting a very critical problem.
Mhm.
And I think this will come out strongly in also our recommendations.
Thank you, Rael.
Great, I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that quote. That might be my quote of the session so far. The problem is not that we're not undertaking research. I just think that's so true.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
plenty of very rich, very rigorous knowledge out there. But exactly as you say, it's just for for reasons that are no fault at all of the people doing that. It doesn't always find its way into the the international literature, and that's these are bigger issues about financing, funding, and things like that. So I mean, thanks for that question and also for that contribution. Anyone else have any questions? I have one that I'm going to ask. If not, I've got a question for Jean Omso based on the second presentation. And I'd like to ask a bit about mangroves and about their role in disaster risk reduction. So I'm really interested in nature-based solutions. It's something I'm interested in, but I'm also aware that that's a reasonably new term, and it's a term that has come from the global north, from richer nations, and it tends to be forced on different parts of the world. So what I wonder is, when we talk about protecting mangroves, is there a longer knowledge in some of the communities you've worked with of how mangroves can reduce disaster risk? Have people known that for a longer time? Are there things going on that we think of as nature-based solutions, but we don't call them that? Is there a longer history there? I'd just like to know a little bit more about that.
Okay, so I think you're referring to traditional knowledge. Yes, from research, yes. Yeah. From research, yes, but I think there would be, but I didn't, ask that question when I went to the communities. But what I know they do is they do a lot of mud piling in place of planting of mangroves, because they use these mangroves for fish smoking and a lot of other things. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And then a follow-on question that I had as well, and I apologize if this was in the presentation, I just didn't quite catch it, but do you have any sense of any potential trade-offs that you might have to make with the different contributions that you get from mangroves in terms of reducing flood risk versus, for example, carbon sequestration? Is there any sense of where there might have to be trade-offs between the different contributions?
Could you say that again?
Basically, when we're planning and when we're managing coastal ecosystems, we can ask them to do lots of different things. So that might be reducing risk. It might be soaking up carbon dioxide. It might be helping people's livelihoods with farming or fishing. Is there any sense which of the benefits we get from mangroves are prioritized, and are there other things that have to be given up because of that?
So I'm going to attempt this question. So yeah, there are other roles of mangroves, but my research was specifically as it has to do with flooding. Yeah, there are lots of research on the role of mangroves in carbon sequestration, but that wasn't my focus. My focus was mostly on disaster risk reduction, and that is flooding. So that was the main focus of my research. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's great. That's no problem at all. As I say, I apologise that I asked something that was a bit out of scope there. That was a bad habit of mine. But thanks very much for your answer. I see we've got a hand up from Eric. Eric, I'll ask you to come in and ask a question.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I am also part of the first cohort of ISCO, and I'm now working with Hiempuano, basically focusing on landscapes and coastal livelihoods and other things within our coast. Basically, when it comes to the mangrove, I want to make some contribution. You were talking about nature-based solution. Yes, actually, from my experience, the people have much understanding or when it comes to mangrove serving as a buffer, protecting them from disasters like flooding and all that. But what's happened is that there are a lot of trade-offs that is being done in these areas because of how they are more connected with these mangroves and how they depend on them. So what we are trying to do is that with that understanding that they have, the people are now having the zeal of having to restore these degraded mangroves, of which they are dependent on it. So actually, when it comes to the nature-based solution, the people have a much idea about all these things because they themselves have witnessed areas that they have been protected or buffered from these disasters. So it is really applicable in our terrain. And also talking about the opportunities and also the people trying to understand the use of these mangroves and also how we can trade off certain things for them to be able to. I think Hiempuano, for instance, we are trying to use the restoration approach to improve the livelihood of the people themselves. They are not only restoring it, but they are also getting something out of it. And that is also a massive contribution that is being made. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for that extra contribution. Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Hi, Leslie.
Ask, water. Hi.
Yeah, so I just wanted to contribute that, in terms of mangroves and other green infrastructure, we do have knowledge gaps, here as a developing country or in most developing contexts, in terms of, traditionally people, we don't value the mangroves in terms of ecosystem services or the biodiversity contributions. So now we're talking of protective capacity versus ecosystem services. So these are knowledge gaps, the areas where we actually need to go to inquire and understand the preferences of the people and their perceptions regarding mangroves as a protective measure, and also in terms of ecosystem services. So yes, we still have a lot of research to do to establish how best we can use nature-based solutions in developing contexts, and also the perceptions and willingness of the communities to embrace nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Thanks very much for that, Blessing. It's good to know that there's a lot of ongoing work there. Clearly, it's a very complex issue, and there's a lot of rich knowledge, as you say, especially at the community level, of what people prefer, what people kind of require, and a lot of work to be done to kind of understand that. So thanks for the insight into what's going on around mangroves. As I said, Liana's hand is up. I'll let Liana come in before I ask my final question.
Yes, I wanted to also ask our presenter on groundwater. I think it's a very critical issue because it's a major source of drinking water. And you had touched on the bacteriological pollution because of the way that the wells are sited and constructed. Did you also include looking into heavy metals because of the mining, the small scale mining that's going on, as well as nutrient pollution that can affect it because of the use of fertilizers that go through or can penetrate the groundwater?
Thank you, Liana, for that question. Yes, I did. So I also considered heavy metals and nutrients, because in one of the areas where I'm doing my research, Keta, there is a intensive agriculture going there, and I know that would have an influence on nutrient concentrations. Yeah. Aside that, the siting of the septic tanks in close proximity to the wells could also affect nutrients concentrations in the wells, especially nitrates. So I considered nutrients in my work. It's just that I didn't include it in this presentation because of the limited time we had.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'll just take that opportunity to ask my follow-on question then, which was, so we saw there was a lot of kind of survey and observation-based work, but we also saw focus groups. And I'm a qualitative researcher myself, so I always really like the idea of actually going out and hearing what people think. People were telling you in the focus groups, did that match up to what you saw in your observations? And also in your analysis, how do you bring together these different types of data?
Okay, so in most cases, what they were saying matched up with what I was observing on the field, except in a situation where they felt they are, okay, so in terms of pollution sources, most of them believed that the position of those gutters, the waste drains, and the septic tanks were not a problem. They felt it doesn't affect groundwater pollution, but I knew it was a source of pollution. And why I asked them, they felt no, the water table is very deep down there. What we have up here does not affect it. And so because I knew that it does affect it, I had to include that as a risk factor, even though they didn't see those things as risk factors. And then you asked about how I put together the different data, my field observations and the interviews. So I used the thematic analysis. I had to put their responses in themes, the themes that were being generated or coming out of what they were saying. those were the key things I looked at for, because I had 4 interviews in the 4. So I had 1 interview in each of the communities.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that. Thanks for that detail. Again, just kind of, as you say, knowing that context, noticing where people don't always kind of understand things, particularly for things that happen under the ground, and particularly for things that happen in the subsurface. You know, people's knowledge of depth and how things move about. You know, I'm not an expert in groundwater, but I know from some of my energy research and looking at the subsurface, how people understand what goes on under our feet and the depths and how things relate can be quite challenging. Eric, I saw your hand was up again.
Yeah, I think I want to understand from the presenter. Actually, I mixed the presentation, but I want to know whether the research actually look at the biophysical structure of the soil, like how is it possible for the pollutants to pass through those stages and get to the underground water. Because I have also worked in the landscape. It's a very good area for groundwater potential where water can easily infiltrate. But what we have, the gap that we have is the ability to understand how these pollutants might be able to move through the various stages of the soil. And that is what's actually, and I want to understand whether that thing was done.
Okay, so my research did not consider contaminant transports, but there are already some studies on contaminant transports across aquifers. So I had to pull some knowledge from those existing research in explaining how these contaminants, for example, microbes and nutrients move across these aquifers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much. If anybody has any further questions, please do ask them now.
I just wanted to comment on the high degree of representation of women scientists in today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Liana. It's an arbitrary move by ESCO to make sure that they empower the ladies. All right.
Excellent presentations too.
Yep, thank you very much. I would agree with that, Liana.
Much.
Yeah. I just wanted to say a few kind of words just to wrap up. I think I saw some comments in the chat there, but yeah, I think we saw a lot of common themes across the different talks today, which in a sense reflect some of the things we saw in the first theme, but also open up new avenues. So I think again today we saw this issue of, well, you know, whose knowledge and whose experience counts when we're understanding, you know, how we manage complex environments, and under a just transition, you know, whose knowledge is included. We saw in the Q&A especially, there's a lot of research out there, you know, and there's a lot of obligation, I think, on international organizations and academics like myself in wealthier nations to really try and create opportunities to bring that in. So, you know, this question of whose knowledge counts and how you get very rich data that's out there into the international discourse is, I think, an important issue. I think there's also an interesting theme here about interrogating and analysing data. You know, and again, we saw, you know, you have communities where they have very rich and deep understandings of what's going on. We've seen, you know, mixed method, multi-method, interdisciplinary research here. And Naline's question as well about doing as much as you can when you're in the field. There's a lot to be said about going to places, collecting a lot of rich data, but then thinking, how do we then bring that together in maybe interesting or ways that can really help us to understand what's going on? And that, I think, is what gives us the insight into how a just transition can support livelihoods. You know, how you bring that together to understand the impact of changes on livelihoods. And the third and final point, I think it's a really important one, is finance and the question of who pays for all of this. I think everybody talked about financing. And again, in a global sense, when we think about a just transition to a sustainable society, there's a really big question here again about fairness. And again, that's something that happens at a global level, and the importance again of richer nations realizing the obligations they have to provide that financial support, and that realizing, you know, as we said, there's a lot of knowledge out there, there's a lot of good work out there, there's a lot of very rich understanding of how you can achieve sustainable livelihoods, but that needs financing and funding, and it's important that that burden is not placed on the people who have done the least to contribute to environmental change. So on that note, I'm going to stop, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our presenters for their great work and their questions. And we look forward to welcoming you to future Future Earth Coasts Just Transitions webinars. Thank you very much.